Hello and welcome. Good afternoon to all of you. I'm Joanne Berger-Sweeney. I'm president of Trinity College, and I hope everybody in the room knows it, but it's just a good thing to say. I'm really thrilled that you have joined us for today's discussion on the past, present, and future of our national pastime, baseball. Indeed, it's a sport we all love, and we're especially fortunate to be joined by leading experts in their fields on our discussion. I'm pleased to introduce George Will, class of 1962, who will be part of today's discussion. If you want to come up and take a seat. For the 0.1% of you who might not know who George Will is, I will share that he is a nationally syndicated columnist and recipient of the Pulitzer Prize for commentary. He's written 2 best-selling books on the game of baseball, and his success serves as a testament to the true values of a liberal arts education. Now, facilitating the discussion is also Bill Marimow, class of 1969. Please come. Bill has won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for stories he co-wrote and his excellence in journalism at places including the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Baltimore Sun, and National Public Radio. They've earned him numerous awards and honors, a list that's really too long to review today. So please join me in welcoming George and Bill for our panel on baseball going back to the future. We are honored to have them here.
Well, welcome. It's great to see a terrific crowd out here. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about the format before we begin discussing baseball and other topics. First of all, George and I decided to call an audible at the line of scrimmage to mix some metaphor. And we're going to talk about baseball for about 20 minutes or so. Then we're going to move over into politics, government, freedom of speech, and the state of journalism today. And we're also going to reserve half of our session for questions from all of you. So think of your questions, be bold, and adventuresome. I want to start out by talking a little bit about a book I read in the last week. It's called A Nice Little Place on the North Side, A History of Triumph, Mostly Defeat, and Incurable Hope at Wrigley Field. This is a book by George. It's not a big volume, but for all of you baseball fans, especially Cub fans, I would highly recommend it. In the book, George mentions that he has this quote, "Reason rarely regulates love." And George, I'd like you to talk a little bit about how a young man from Champaign became a Cubs fan, and that quote.
Well, Champaign, Illinois is midway between Chicago and St. Louis. My father taught at the University of Illinois. And at an age too young to make life-shaping decisions, I had to choose between being a Cub fan and a Cardinal fan. All my friends became Cardinal fans and grew up cheerful and liberal. I became a dyspeptic conservative. I played baseball briefly and badly in Little League for the Mittendorf Funeral Home Panthers. Our color was black. As I recall, I played right field because that was the consensus was I could do least damage in right field.
So George, as I recall, you were on a committee appointed by Bud Selig to review the rules of baseball. And what did you come up with then? And how does that pertain to some of the things that have happened now?
Well, the committee I was on was called On-Field Changes, and our principal contribution was instant replay. But Commissioner Manford gets the credit for the new rules this year, all of which I think are splendid. Baseball had a terrible problem, and the fans were telling them that because annual attendance fell by 7 million people in the 20 teens. The games were getting longer, and the action was getting more rare. That's a very bad combination if you're in the entertainment business. The game became increasingly a game of three true outcomes, as they say in baseball. Strikeouts, walks, and home runs were 1/3 of all at-bats. In the last game of the 2020 World Series, the Dodgers against the Rays, the most watched game of that year, there were 54 outs, 27 of them were strikeouts, exactly half. The ball was put in play on average every 6 minutes and 20 seconds, and in the last 25 minutes of the game, the ball was put in play twice. Now, this at a time when the problem in baseball, which makes it so interesting if you're not a baseball fan, but as how you change systems, and as evidence that something in America actually can be fixed. The problem in baseball was that everyone was behaving rationally on the basis of abundant, accurate information. It's what baseball calls analytics and normal people call information. It was about every player's tendency, about the spin rates of pitchers, about launch angles, and offense became suffocated. I don't think Ted Williams probably ever faced a pitcher throwing 100, probably rarely 98. 100-mile-an-hour pitches are a dime a dozen these days. Velocity was overwhelming the game. People had to say, look, are we most apt to get 3 singles off DeGrom or any of these fine pitchers, or should we just try and hit a home run? Well, the home run seemed more rational, particularly when the shift came in. Shifts were relatively unknown through most of baseball. In the last 10 years or so, they became ubiquitous. And the shift meant basically moving someone from the left side of the infield to the right side. What this did was, it meant you had to hit the ball over the shift, or you had to consent to striking out or walking. This became boring. And worst of all, we have these astonishing athletes now not allowed to show their athleticism. A baseball player spends a lot more time with leather on his hands than with wood in his hands. We have these stupendous fielders like Arenado of the Cardinals and Lindor of the Mets, but they weren't catching the ball because the ball was not being put in play. So what Major League Baseball did, they decided to go back to the future. That is, to restore the game we grew up with. Now, under the new rule, you have to have 2 infielders on each side of second base with their spikes on the dirt when the ball is pitched. The pitch clock is the most wonderful thing because it helps dampen the effect of velocity. Pitchers used to do maximum effort. Am I still on? No, I'm not. Hello? No.
Uh-oh. A relief pitcher has arrived on the scene.
There we go. There we go. Pitchers would throw with maximum effort and then take 25 seconds to recuperate so that they could do it again. Now, when you have 15 seconds to deliver the ball and 20 seconds with a runner on base, you can't do that. So you have to quit being just a thrower and become a pitcher again. As a result, the games have been shortened by about half an hour of entirely dead time. The athleticism of the players is on display again because they have to move to get the ball. They can't be pre-positioned where the ball is going to go. So it's a classic example of a game rediscovering itself. We conservatives are always being told you can't turn the clock back. Major League Baseball did, and we're better off for it.
George, in a recent column, you talked about the contrast between a game that some of us may remember, the seventh game of the 1960 World Series, in which the Yankees lost to the Pittsburgh Pirates 10-9. And you contrasted that game with some of the marathons of last season. Could you talk about that just for a moment?
Well, that game was 2 hours, 19 runs scored, and the game was about 2 hours and 20 minutes long. One pitcher was 5'6", and another was 5'8", Elroy Face and Bobby Shantz. There were 0 strikeouts in that game, not one. And I can actually tell you, I'm sure this is the case, not one batter in the entire game stepped out of the batter's box once he stepped in. It just wasn't done. So the game was made for normal-sized people. Bill Veeck, the great owner of the Indians and then the Browns and then the White Sox, once said, the great thing about baseball is you don't have to be 7 feet tall or 7 feet wide. Just like a normal person. Today, it's a 6'5" pitcher is quite common. Some are more than that, which means that we have effectively, in two senses, moved the pitching rubber closer to home plate. We all say it's still 60 feet, 6 inches away. But if Whitey Ford, who would not even be drafted nowadays, even though he's a left-hander, because he was only 5'10", Stroman of the Cubs right now is a freak. He's 5'8" and was just named Pitcher of the Week. But most of these guys are 6'5", a lot of them are 6'5", which means they release the ball about 1.5 feet closer to home plate than Whitey Ford did. Now, if you add to that these guys are throwing 6, 7, 8 miles per hour faster, that's another, say, 8 inches. So we've effectively moved the pitching rubber closer to home plate, which, since we're talking about milliseconds that the batter has to make up his mind and to make contact with a round bat on a round ball moving vertically and horizontally, that makes a big difference.
So, George, probably most of you who are baseball fans have read George's book, Men at Work. And if you haven't read it, I highly commend it to you. And I asked George this question before today because I wanted him to think about it. Back in 1988, when he wrote this book, he picked out 3 players and 1 manager to interview in depth and talk about the nuances and the intricacies of the game. The hitter was Tony Gwynn. The fielder was Cal Ripken, both of them now in the Hall of Fame. The pitcher was Earl Hershiser from the LA Dodgers, who that season had a great season. I see a Los Angeles Dodger fan out there. Yep. And the manager was Tony La Russa. I'm interested, George, if you were doing that book today, what 4 people would you choose and why?
Let me begin by saying that I've published 16 books, and that one has sold more than the other 15 combined.
And maybe we'll have 300 more after today.
My manager would be Buck Showalter, and he's probably going to be fired before the end of the day. So he'll be available. The Mets have lost God knows how many in a row, and his owner, Steve Cohen, didn't get rich by being patient. My position player would be a catcher. It's a funny thing about baseball. The action begins with the defense holding the ball, the pitcher, and the most important position player is in foul territory, the catcher. And the catcher runs the game, and so I'd pick Real Muto of the Phillies. My hitter is going to surprise you, would be a guy you haven't heard of, but you're about to, named Arraez, A-R-R-A-E-Z. He plays for the Miami Marlins, and as we speak here this afternoon, he's batting 400. Oh. They can't get him out, and it's because he hits the ball, hit them where they ain't. He can spray the ball over the field. He's making baseball safe again for Rod Carew and Tony Gwynn and these other guys who are absolute geniuses wielding a bat like a wand. My pitcher would be Alcantara of the Rays, who no one knows because he plays in Tampa, and no one in Tampa goes to the games. But he's just a phenomenal pitcher, not just a thrower.
Being a Phillies fan, I'd like you to expand just a little bit on why you picked Real Muto.
Well, he plays the whole game. He's a great base runner and he's a great hitter, but he also handles pitchers well. And he can also frame. Framing is very valued in baseball. Catchers can catch a ball and in a way that tries to fool the umpires and sometimes does. That to frame it is to take a ball that's on the edge of the strike zone and pull it in. Doesn't sound like much, but 3 or 4 times a game, if instead of the batter being 2 balls and 1 strike, he's 1 ball and 2 strikes, can change the course of the game. Now, there's automated strike zones are coming. They'll still need an umpire behind home plate for catcher's interference and check swings and all the rest, but it's coming. Here's the problem. Here's home plate. Got the pointing back to the catcher. If a ball comes in right at the upper corner, the machine's going to call that a strike, and it is unhittable. I mentioned this to Buck Showalter the other day when he was in Washington. He said, give it to the pitcher. Any pitcher who can do that deserves it. And all of baseball's changes always help the offense. Let's give the pitcher a break.
George, another column that I read of yours that I really liked and I thought was very thought-provoking was the one in which you basically tried to define the Baseball Hall of Fame. Was it either a shrine or a museum? And you related that to a lot of the great players who were accused of using steroids and undoubtedly did. Could you talk about the distinction between the Hall of Fame as a museum and a shrine, and how that pertains to players like Roger Clemens?
Well, in common sports writer parlance, when someone's elected to the Hall of Fame, we say they're enshrined. And when you get a ballot, I don't get one, but when people do get a ballot to vote on Hall of Fame membership, it says you're supposed to consider their records, their numbers they put up, but also sportsmanship, contributions to the game, et cetera, character in short. Now, there are some people in the Hall of Fame who had abominable characters. I mean, you wouldn't want to sit next to Ty Cobb at dinner. But, so baseball has to decide if the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown is a record-keeping museum, then you have to have the hit leader of all of Major League Baseball, Pete Rose. You have to have the home run leader of Barry Bonds, Sammy Sosa, lots of these people. If, however, it is a shrine, if it has these other more interesting criteria, then you have to keep them out. But the Hall of Fame has to decide. Now, in a way, the veterans have decided, because the highlight of the Hall of Fame every year is when the veterans come back. And a whole bunch of veterans are not coming back ever again, they have said, if the Hall of Fame admits people who were better ball players through chemistry.
George, in that column, you talked about the fact that a lot of the players who used steroids diminished in some way the accomplishments of those players who didn't on the field. So I'm wondering how where would you put Pete Rose, who apparently didn't use steroids but bet on games and was disqualified from the Hall?
Well, Pete Rose walked past the bulletin board that's in every Major League clubhouse, I don't know, 30,000 times. And in it, in bold face, it says anyone who bets on a Major League game, it didn't say betting against your team, it says bet on Major League game, shall be forever ineligible to be in Major League Baseball. It wasn't a secret. He had what's called due notice of what the problem was. Now, he was a problem gambler, and he was a man of interesting character. And baseball has to decide whether it meant what it said about the dangers of gambling. Now, that's a legacy of the 1919 Black Sox scandal where gamblers fixed the World Series to get the White Sox to throw the series. But baseball's got a funny problem now because we've legalized sports gambling. There's a sports book in Wrigley Field now and one in Nat Stadium and elsewhere around the sports. Major League Baseball is trying to move the Oakland A's to Las Vegas, for Pete's sake. A town that comes awake at night at 8 in the evening. A town where everyone is from elsewhere. And no one goes to Las Vegas to go to a ball game. Clark County, Nevada it's a big city now, but it's the 40th largest TV market in the country. And outside there are sheep and cactus, and that's it. So I don't know what they're going to do for local broadcast revenues, but with regard to gambling, it is weird to make a big deal out of this now with Pete Rose, although you sort of have to.
Good. George, in terms of baseball writers who you admire and read regularly, past and present, who are the 4 or 5 in your pantheon of great baseball writers?
Well, at the top it would be the New Yorker's Roger Angell, who was just phenomenal. Beyond that, I'd say Tom Boswell of the Post, now retired, but still writing. That's the third of my it would be Tom Verducci, who writes for The Athletic and a number of other things, and is just the reason I watch. People sometimes ask me, what do I watch on television? I say, well, that's easy. I get to my office desk at 8:30 in the morning, turn on the Major League Baseball channel, and turn it off when I leave at 6:30. Because for the same reason if I watch anything else, I watch CNBC. Because these are people who know things. I'm not interested in their opinions. I want to know what the stock's going to do of Amazon. I want to know who's going to start for the Mets, that sort of thing. It's a high intensity of fact in journalism on those 2 channels and only on those 2 channels.
Before we turn to current day events, I want to go back to the Chicago Cubs for just a minute to sort of complete the cycle and ask, are you still a dedicated Cubs fan? How frequently do you follow them? And how do you think they're doing this season?
They're in danger of losing their grip on last place. They're not very good, but they're not very good in a not very good division, which helps. I mean, the Pittsburgh Pirates are leading the Central. So the Cubs are, look, if winning every day is what gives you pleasure, you're in the wrong sport. An NFL team that loses 3 games in a row, the fan base melts. Every team that goes to spring training knows they're going to win 60 games a year, and they're going to win, unless you're this year's Oakland A's, but forget that. Every team goes to spring training knowing they're going to win 60 games and they're going to lose 60 games. They play the whole damn season to sort out the middle 42 games. Baseball's about failure. If you win 10 out of 20 games, you're definitionally mediocre. If you win 11 out of 20 games, you've got a shot to play in October, which is why the cumulative effect of doing things right in baseball, the small things, hitting behind the runner, advancing the runner, hitting the cutoff man, and all the rest, adds up. The beauty of 162 games and 187 days is that at the end of the season, you are your record. You can't say, well, we're really better than that. No, you're not. You're exactly what the record says you are. It is the severest meritocracy left in the United States.
And George, would you talk just a little bit about your favorite childhood player, Mr. Cub, Ernie Banks?
Yeah, all the other teams had athletes. We had Ernie Banks. And why he ever saw a strike, I don't know, because no one hitting behind him mattered. but he hit 411 home runs, 511 home runs. He was one of the last major league players who'd played in the Negro Leagues. He was manically cheerful, but I guess you had to be to play in the Cubs in those days. I once said, all I remember about my wedding day was the Cubs lost a doubleheader. Speaking of weddings, I should tell you that my wedding ring, which I designed myself, has the Major League Baseball logo on it. My way of telling my wife that in my heart she ranks up there close to baseball.
Okay. We're now going to turn to the topics of politics, government, freedom of expression, and journalism before we take your questions. And George, I want to start out with one that maybe it's a forecast. You had a recent column on Ron DeSantis' recent Twitter disaster, and you talked about the millions of people, I'm one of them, who have what you called, quote, pugnacity fatigue, close quotes. What I want to know is, you're a student of history. Do you see a time where this pugnacity is going to abate and we'll go back to an era where the parties compromise, reciprocate, and horse trade?
Sure. The fundamental conservative insight about life is nothing less. The Roman Empire, Carolingian Empire, Ottoman Empire, British Empire, Habsburg Empire, Spanish, Portuguese, Russian empires, nothing lasts in this world. The idea, therefore, that what we have today in our politics is going to go on forever isn't going to happen. Nothing goes on forever. And we've had worse times. Go back and read the journalism and the political rhetoric of the 1790s. In 1787, the framers give us our Constitution. They neither anticipated nor desired the emergence of political parties. By 1800, we had political parties, and we had a ferocious partisanship and scabrous rhetoric. Go back to the 1850s when a member of the House came onto the Senate floor, Preston Brooks, and nearly beat Senator Sumner of Massachusetts to death. Sumner was absent from the Senate for years. We've been through bad times before and will be again. We will emerge from this. Democracy is chaotic, just is. It doesn't have to be this chaotic and this disagreeable, but a woman elected to the British House of Commons a few years ago in her maiden speech said, democracy is like sex. If it isn't messy, you're not doing it right. So, I mean, this is the nature of the beast. There are passions, and there's rhetoric to rouse the passions, and there are people who would rather rouse passions than do anything else. That's an occupational hazard of popular government, and I think we will get through this. The question is, do we really want to go on being angry? I do not think the American people are angry. I think they're exhausted and embarrassed by our public life. And I think they're waiting for what I would call a deep breath candidate. Someone who turns to them and says, deep breath, everybody. Been here before, done that. And he will quote from Lincoln's first inaugural, where he concluded by saying, we are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. We're not. Most Americans are not like that. Look, this is the rage machine of talk radio and cable television can churn on, but there are 332 million people in this country, and at any given moment, about 325 million of them are not watching cable television, not listening to talk radio. They're getting on with life. And the problem right now that makes this so frustrating is that there's a colossal market failure in the political market. There's an enormous demand in both parties for something other than a rerun of 2020. A majority of Democrats do not want the president to run again. A majority of Republicans don't want Donald Trump to be nominated. But we have this tremendous demand not producing supply. And the problem is the nominating process, which has been democratized, which means it's dominated not by numbers, but by the intense, compact, ideologically inflamed minorities in both parties, which is what you get from democracy if you're not careful. And it remains to be seen. I happen to think this may be the wish being father to the thought. I'm not even certain Mr. Biden's going to run again. And I'm pretty sure that the air is going to come out of the current leader in the Republican field. Who steps in, I don't know. I've got my preferences and my expectations. But when it comes to political prophecy is optional folly. So my rule is the Zeke Benura principle. Zeke was a major league first baseman of spectacular immobility. But Zeke understood the rule of baseball that you will not be charged with an error if you do not touch the ball.
George, you seem fairly convinced that there is going to be an abatement of this hostility. Are there any signs that you can point to now as a political analyst that encourage you to believe this other than the sweep of history?
Well, the debt deal was, again, messy, but that's life. And they split a lot of differences. And on the one issue that is supposed to epitomize the politics of unsplittable differences, abortion, don't look now, but it's happening. The differences are being split. The Supreme Court did the nation an enormous favor by overturning Roe v. Wade and restoring abortion to democratic debate. 50 democratic debates in 50 states. And what the Supreme Court said was, we're out of the abortion policy business. That's not what judges are for. You guys figure this out. Now we have Republican Governor Youngkin of Virginia saying, I am pro-life, and I'm for a 15-week limit. You have Republican Governor Sununu of New Hampshire says, I'm pro-choice, and I'm for a 15-week limit on abortion. It sounds to me like a consensus emerging. What the American people, different states, some states are going to be outliers. That's given. California and Massachusetts will legalize abortion through the end of the third trimester. Mississippi, 6 weeks. South Carolina, 6 weeks. But at 15 weeks, legalizes 93% of all abortions in the United States. We're going to settle somewhere about where Europe has, which is 12 to 15 weeks, and move on.
Today I read editorials in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times about the Trump indictment. The Wall Street Journal article basically said it was going to be cause an upheaval in the United States, and they thought it was a mistake to have a federal grand jury indict a former president. The New York Times said it was crystal clear that he'd broken the law. 23 grand jurors who didn't know the ex-president voted to indict him, and it was very important to see the process through. George, I'm interested in your thoughts about the indictment and those two completely opposing points of view.
Well, with regard to the grand jury, it's been famously said that any prosecutor can get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich. So what the grand jury did doesn't impress me. The most commonly uttered phrase in all this is, well, no one's above the law. That's less a thought than an excuse for not thinking about the problem here. And the problem is this: not only is this a former president, this is someone who the people got elected president, who governed for 4 years and running for re-election got more votes than he did the first time. 74 million people out there voted for this man, and you do not indict him casually in a country already divided and inflamed in many ways. What Trump did with the documents, there's a substantive problem and then the process problem. The substantive problem is he had things he shouldn't have had, and he stored them in a bathroom, for God's sake. And he may have been reading a document about a military attack plan on Iran to some God knows who. I mean, he's a shallow, silly, foolish man. This is not a news bulletin. And he shouldn't have done it. But the question is, a prosecutor enjoys a lot of and ought to demonstrate a lot of discretion. So, well, and by the way, trying to explain to the country the small differences that separate what Trump did and Joe Biden storing classified information next to his Corvette in his Wilmington garage, and Mike Pence and Hillary Clinton's servers, distinctions can be drawn. I'm not saying they can't, but try and tell that to a relatively inattentive continental nation. It's going to be very hard to make this seem other than selective prosecution. I yield to no one in my dislike of the last president, nor he of me, for that matter. But I think it simply won't do to say, well, if you break the law, you get prosecuted. This is different.
Thanks. I want to ask a question about freedom of expression and freedom of speech. And yesterday, President Joanne Berger Sweeney had some words of wisdom about the purpose of a Trinity education, and that the Trinity education is designed, ideally, to tell us how to think, not what to think. And I agree. In many campuses around the country, there's been an escalating and often extremely vituperative intolerance of other points of view, particularly the conservative point of view. George did a column recently about what happened at Stanford Law School when a Fifth Circuit federal judge was invited by the Federalist Society to speak there. He walked into the room. Before he could even start, students began harassing him, shouting, disrupting him. He couldn't speak. He asked for an administrator to come make the piece so he could give the speech that he was invited to make. And she got up and over an 11-minute period lectured him. Basically said he had to understand that the views he'd expressed from the bench were abhorrent to many of these students, that many of them hated what he had to say and what he thought. And after she lectured, she told the students, if you don't want to listen to what the judge has to say, you're welcome to leave now. George, you wrote a column about it. I'd be interested in your thoughts on what happened there and what can be done in the future to promote civility and free speech.
One of the mysteries of that is how Stanford Law School has its pick of the cream of the crop from undergraduates who want to become lawyers. How did the admissions process admit hundreds of louts like those who shouted this man down? It is simply a fact that free speech is most endangered today where it should be most secure, which is on college campuses, where, for some reason, I do not know why this is, young people on our campuses are objectively the most privileged, cosseted, and safe people on the planet Earth. They arrive at the campus demanding a safe space. Safe from what? From ideas? They're there to be exposed to ideas. Safe from discomfort? Who cares about their comfort? I mean, they're not there to be comfortable. They're there to be, if anything, disrupted in their thinking. I was talking before I became too toxic to go to campuses. I've been canceled twice by campuses. But I was at a campus, and a young woman got up and said about, I forgot what issue we were talking. She says, my feelings are, and I said, stop right there. I'm not interested in my own feelings. Why should I be interested in your feelings? You got ideas? Let's hear them. You got information? I'm all ears. But don't tell me it's your feelings. This is too serious for that. if someone, the policy on disruption of speakers is really simple. If you disrupt a speaker, you're no longer associated with the institution. Go back to your room, pack your bags, go home, go up to your bedroom, pull the cover over your head, and stay there until the world is safe enough for you. I don't know how this happened, how we began to raise children who feel threatened, not just they don't just feel threatened by ideas and something that make them uncomfortable, people who feel we have to protect them from to kill a mockingbird and Huckleberry Finn, the book from which, as Hemingway said, all of American literature essentially descends. My feeling is that it has something to do with when the noun parent became a verb. I'm a parent, you're a parent, we're all parents, but at some point in the last 20 years, we began to talk about parenting, and I parent people. And the idea was that parenting became a comprehensive, almost scientific application of our skills to turn out perfect young people. I got 4 children. I know what a chimera that is. You know, the whole point of civilization is to civilize adolescent males. That's it. I'm quite serious. And that's a full-time job. The idea that we're going to parent these people into perfection is, well, no one has had children thinks that way after they've had children. But we have a generation of children who've been sent into our colleges by parents who think they've told these children over and over again they're special. They've never had unsupervised play. They've been driven from computer lessons to ballet lessons to whatever. They never had to have unsupervised fights and troubles with their peers that they had to learn how to solve. So they arrive there on campus demanding a safe space. Again, I recommend their bedrooms.
I would urge all of you, if you have a chance, to take a look at the video of what happened at Stanford Law School. To see it is to believe it and to really cringe. To only hear about it and read about it is not sufficient. But George's column had a link to it, which I followed, and it is really worthwhile to check it out. Last question on freedom of the press, and then we're going to turn to your questions. And this relates to the, in my opinion, the great First Amendment decision, New York Times versus Sullivan, which says when you're writing about a public official in public duties, for a story to be defamatory, it's got to be, number one, false, it's got to hurt the reputation, and it's got to be written with a reckless disregard of the truth. Lately, a couple Supreme Court justices, along with Governor Ron DeSantis, have talked about their belief that Times versus Sullivan should be weakened. George, I'm wondering how you feel about the law and their efforts to dilute it.
I like the New York Times v. Sullivan decision. I'm opposed to changing it, but I think that's a tiny part of the problem of the press. The bigger problem is this. A large number of journalists decided, because it was fun to decide it, that with the arrival of Donald Trump, we were in a perpetual emergency, and they were going to save democracy. That's not their job. Their job is to tell us what's happening. Once you begin to have crusading journalists who think that they are the thin line that stands between us and tyranny, it inflates their egos even more than their normal in newsrooms. The Washington Post put on its masthead, "Democracy dies in darkness," very dramatic, and implicitly the Washington Post is the light, which I seriously doubt. Something has changed in the business model of journalism that exacerbates this. New York Times used to be supported by ads from Bergdorf Goodman, Lord & Taylor, Saks Fifth Avenue, Macy's, Kimball's, Tiffany's, Van Cleef Arpels, etc. Now the New York Times is supported by digital subscribers. And for them, becoming a digital subscriber of the Times is making a political statement. It's an ideological affirmation. And if you don't think that affects how they cover things and what they cover, you're mistaken. I know that the Washington Post says our readers, our digital subscribers, they're all, that the business model is now common in the large papers. Our readers want to read about climate change. So a forest fire in Germany will be, the headline will associate it with climate change, which science says you just can't do. But journalism economics says we're going to do it anyway. So I think that the real problem in journalism is that people now relate to their sources in a different way. Consumers of journalism today are so subject to confirmation bias. That is, they are open only to that information that, to go back to our students, makes them comfortable. They want it from sympathetic sources. Everyone's living in their intellectual silos. Now, how this plays out over the years, I don't know. I don't know if any young person under 30 who reads the hard copy of a newspaper. They may not even read it online. Fewer and fewer people are watching what's left of CNN, and we know I've worked for both MSNBC and Fox, and they're exactly alike. They exist to feed their red meat to their bases, keep people churned up. Breaking news, it says, bombshell, it's all nonsense. It won't last 3 days, whatever the latest bombshell is. But it's a rage machine. There's a certain number of Americans, not a lot, but they're tone setting, who only feel alive when they're furious. And they turn on television to be made furious. And it's unhealthy.
So George, when you want to read something that's meaningful and accurate in terms of news or news analysis, or watch something, who do you trust? Which publications?
Well, I read the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the New York Times because they all have some very good writers, very good editors. You just have to read it with a jaundiced eye because there's a lot of politics involved. There's an enormous amount of good writing out there. I read every morning on my phone what are called the aggregators. Real Clear Politics, Real Clear Policy, Real Clear World, Real Clear Defense, Real Clear Markets, that aggregate a bunch of articles, maybe 10, 20, 30 on each of these, from that day's journalism, and you pick and choose. And you begin to figure out who's smart and who isn't. So there's a cornucopia of information out there at our fingertips on our wonderful iPhones. You just have to be careful.
And analogous to the question I asked about baseball, which 2 or 3 political writers do you read with astute interest who you find extremely perceptive?
Let's see. There's a young man that the Washington Post poached from the Wall Street Journal called Jason Willick, who's very good, and you're going to hear a lot from him as the years go by. Holman Jenkins is a curmudgeonly fellow, but he's awfully good in the Wall Street Journal. And I suppose Jason Riley, some others like that. Galston, who's with the Brookings Institution, writes a Friday column in the Wall Street Journal regularly, is also good.
Okay, before we move on to your questions, my mantra for all of you is this, and it relates to reading the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times editorials. Read broadly, read deeply, and read with skepticism. I think that if you do that every day, day in, day out, you'll be able to come to your own opinions. Good opinions will drive out bad opinions. So now we're ready for questions for George, and if you have any for me, I'll take them too. Why don't we, how about if we go way back there to the man with the gray who's standing up?
One of the biggest scandals in Washington has to
Well,
do with
Mike, use the mic, please.
one of the big scandals in Washington has to do with the U.S. Supreme Court and receipt of gifts from people like Harlan Crow have never been disclosed. What do you think should or could be done about this?
I think under the separation of powers, that's not for Congress to decide to begin with. On my list of 100 things that worry me, frankly, that ranks just above being hit by the Goodyear blimp. The fact that I know Clarence Thomas and I know Harlan Crow, and the fact that Harlan Crow helped put an impoverished nephew of Clarence Thomas's through a school that Harlan Crow attended. If that counts as an in-kind contribution to what, I don't know. But frankly, this is part of a very reckless campaign on the part of certain portions of American politics right now to delegitimize the court because they don't like what the court's doing. And they're going to regret it because, as Alexander Hamilton said, the Supreme Court's the least dangerous branch because it has neither the sword nor the purse. It has only prestige. The Supreme Court we have today is living off the prestige it gained in 1954 in the Brown v. Board of Education decision. And it got that, please note, A, by overturning a precedent. All these people are saying, oh, it's shocking that they overturned Roe v. Wade as a precedent. Plessy v. Ferguson was an older precedent than Roe v. Wade when the Supreme Court, to its eternal credit, overturned it as wrong. It was the one that authorized separate but equal facilities. Second, when the court did that, it went against public opinion. Most Americans, I have a feeling, if you ask them, where did Brown v. Board of Education come from? They'd say, oh, South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, somewhere. No. It was Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, because segregation was far from confined to the Deep South. And there was hardly a majority in this country in favor of desegregating schools by judicial order. So when people say the court has become imperial because it's overturning precedents and ignoring public opinion, it is paid to ignore public opinion. A constitution is a counter-majoritarian document. The First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. I don't care if the public wants it, can't do it, sorry, we ruled that out a long time ago. So the Supreme Court exists not to be democratic.
Yes, sir, right here in the blue hat. We'll get you a microphone.
You guys might got that right.
My friends know.
I like your teaching.
Yeah, kind of as a corollary to your observations about freedom of speech on campus and the issue of kids coming looking for safe spaces. One of the things I've noticed in academia, even at this campus, is safe spaces being defined as special privilege enclaves based on race, foreign nationality, gender preference, whatever you want to call it. And it's not just providing places to go with people of like interest, but it's setting up those groups as lobbying entities within the campus. And then you provide, like this lady at Stanford, functioning as a diversity officer to legitimize those special interest grievances. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, what happens on campuses is the campuses, well, we're going to have safe spaces for those who don't like certain kinds of speech, but we're going to have free speech zones to which free speech will be confined. Bulletin. James Madison's First Amendment turned the United States into a free speech zone. It goes from Portland, Maine to Portland, Oregon. And we don't need to carve out little places for free speech. If people are frightened of speech, they can stay away. But shouting the heckler's veto, that is shouting down a speaker, is a reason for removing people from what should be a chaotic, cacophonous place, a campus. I think as I recall, when I was editor of the Tripod, they burned one of my papers. I think I said something, I know I said something offensive to Vernon Street, all the fraternities. But, they can go ahead and burn the thing. They can't prevent the publication of it. That's an important distinction, I think.
One of the wonderful paragraphs in the Times versus Sullivan case written by Justice William Brennan is that in the marketplace of ideas, good ideas will prevail over bad ideas. If you shout down ideas that you disagree with, there can be no marketplace of ideas. And to me, that's one of the bedrock principles of free speech, and why when you disagree with someone, instead of shouting the person down, you listen, you think about it, and you argue. And I think that same opinion talks about the fact that debate on public issues can be cantankerous, boisterous, argumentative, vituperative. That's America. As George said, democracy is messy. But if you don't listen, you've subordinated democracy to ideology. Let's see. How about this young woman here in the front row? Let's get her a microphone, please. Hold on. We've got you coming.
Thank you. Well, I would like to know what you think about, two issues, but they're both huge. The FBI and what's going on today, and how you think it could be cured or changed or fixed, and crime in our major cities.
Well, with regard to the FBI, one of my children is an FBI agent, and the FBI clearly allowed itself to be drawn into politics. Probably influenced the outcome of the 2016 election when Comey reopened on election eve, practically, the investigation into Hillary Clinton and her server and all the rest. The FBI, if it didn't know better, it should have known better than to get distracted by the fictitious Russian collusion investigation that was aided by 51 deeply irresponsible former intelligence officials who then identified Hunter Biden's laptop, about which you're going to hear a lot more, as Russian disinformation. So all kinds of things got politicized, including the FBI, and I'm sure if or when there's a Republican president, there will be a change of leadership at the FBI. The other part of your question was crime. Look, first thing you do for government is to provide order. Everything else is secondary and optional. We've learned a lot about policing. Thanks to James Q. Wilson and others, great social scientists, we learned that if you don't police small offenses, you get large offenses. It's called the broken window theory. If you have broken windows in a neighborhood are not repaired, you're going to get a lot more broken windows because there becomes a sense of disorder, a sense of an absence of authority. This is why it was not funny when we had all the graffiti put on New York City subway cars. Suddenly you went down into the subway and you were in a realm of disorder. It just visually looked like disorder. Now, San Francisco has essentially decriminalized shoplifting up to $1,000. Nordstrom's is closed, Whole Foods is closed, various Walgreens have closed. I live in a very nice part of the Washington area, right on the edge of Chevy Chase, Maryland, and Upper Washington. About 2-3 blocks from my house is a CVS. 4 times recently, gangs have come in wearing masks, and they just, with big garbage bags, and they take everything off the shelves and they walk out. And no one thinks to call the police because they're not coming. Now, the country won't put up with this. This sense of disorder is going to produce a political backlash. It's going to take a little while, but here the political market's going to work. Even San Francisco turned out their prosecutor, who advocated the decriminalization of shoplifting. It's going to happen elsewhere too. But when crime is not punished, it flourishes. And I mean, that's not complicated. We have to learn this periodically. But it's going to be a huge issue in the coming presidential campaign. Because what happens is now you have in San Francisco what's called a doom loop. Because of the homelessness and the feces and the volatile derelicts and the drug paraphernalia on the streets, people say, well, we're not coming downtown anymore. So the restaurants close. And 30% of commercial real estate is empty in the high rises in San Francisco. So it just spirals down. And how you stop it, I don't know. But San Francisco is a case study now. They built all those hotels with all those big ballrooms to attract conventions. Who's taking a convention to San Francisco these days? Not many. So there are forces at work that are going to correct this, but on the way there are going to be a lot of lives ruined and a lot of elections turned.
Okay, let's see. Let's try on the left-hand side, the guy in the blue blazer. Thank you.
Thank you. Two questions, one political, one baseball. They're somewhat related. Number one, having 24 and 22-year-old young male children, I try to, as you had mentioned, discuss with them that there are cycles, and this is a very disconcerting cycle, and we need to ride it out, do the right thing every day, put in your best effort, don't ever stop. How do I better relate to them that they're not in a doom loop in their lives, number one? And number two, being a lifelong New York Mets fan, how do I prevent myself from avoiding the lifelong doom loop? Thank you.
Yeah, the Mets and the phrase doom loop go together, don't they? Well, you know, love can't buy, money can't buy love, happiness, or a National League pennant, turns out. It's more complicated than that, and aren't we glad? So if I were, I'd think changing teams. With regard to telling our children not to panic, here's what I'd say. No one ever got rich betting against the United States. And people are literally dying to get in. Dying. Walking with their small children from Guatemala to try and get into this hellhole of a country, as we're told. To get into what the last president called American carnage. Social hypochondria is a national recurring affliction. Partly because we had a rather luminous founding with great people with great ideas. And we have failed often to live up to them. But my best friend in Washington was Pat Moynihan, the senator from New York. And when Pat was ambassador to the UN, some guy on Sunday morning television said, Ambassador Moynihan, isn't it awkward representing this imperfect democracy? And Pat said, name a better one. End of argument. Let me give you a thought experiment. In September 1916, there was a surge in the value of Standard Oil stocks. And John D. Rockefeller became America's first billionaire. This is $1 billion 1916 dollars, so it was serious money. Any damn fool can be a billionaire today, but suppose I made you the following offer. I will make you as rich as John D. Rockefeller, but you got to live in 1916. How many of you would take it? No, you wouldn't. You might get a toothache. In 1916, 1 in 10 Americans had a toothache at any given time, and dentistry was not for the faint-hearted. There were no antibiotics. You'd have access to the best entertainment, but Netflix was a ways off. There was a few scratchy phonograph records and a few flickering black and white unsound movies. You could go to all the best Thai and Chinese and Italian restaurants, but there weren't any because globalization hadn't mixed our cultures up so beautifully. Antibiotics, probably the best single thing to come out of the 20th century. Long way off. I think when you think about it, you wouldn't trade, you could be as rich as Rockefeller, you'd rather be whatever you are, you'd rather be in the American middle class in 2023 than a plutocrat in 1916. Things get better in the United States by fits and starts. When you go back to baseball, as I constantly do, when Earl Weaver was the manager of the Baltimore Orioles, Hall of Fame manager, was a short, irascible, dyspeptic, Napoleonic little figure. And when he was out of sorts, as he usually was by the third inning, he was the scourge of American League umpires. He'd come charging out of the dugout, stick his chin into the chest of a much larger umpire, and at the top of his lungs he'd shout, "Are you going to get any better, or is this it?" We're going to get better. We just are. Winston Churchill once said, "The American people invariably do the right thing after they have exhausted all the alternatives." So hang in there and tell your children to cheer up. That's their fault.
So I'm getting a timeout signal, so we're going to have 2 more questions, and then we're going to thank George and adjourn. So let's see. How about someone in the way back? That gentleman, stand up so we can see you and get us a mic, please.
Mr. Will, thank you. I'm going to ask you about an aspiration. No one is above the law. And I'm going to combine 2 responses that you've made. You described what you criticize as the recent indictment of Mr. Trump, which you said really shouldn't have happened because we have a political problem in differentiating that between the behaviors of other presidents. So you've also said we have an issue of the broken window phenomenon. You let little crimes go passing by. What do you do with the big ones? We've all been through January 6th. We've seen other things take place. Are we on a slippery slope that a president can do anything and be above the law?
No, let me be clear. Let me be clear that the January 6th raises its own issues. I think it was a day in American history almost as important as 9/11. A mob attempting to disrupt a constitutional process is as serious as it gets. I'm not saying, I haven't read and got deep into 47 counts in this indictment. And what Trump did was serious. It's kind of serious in the way he does things, which is unserious. He wasn't going to do anything with this stuff. It wasn't like Hansen, the spy. It was just frivolous, deeply, shallowly frivolous. It matters who it is. It matters, just as a matter of prudence, it matters that 74 million people wanted him to be president right now. 74 million. And you better have a real reason here. What worries me is that after you unpack the various items in the indictment, the mishandling of the documents and all, you're going to come down mostly to an obstruction of justice. That is, he interfered with the investigation. And selling that to the American people is going to be difficult if it's a process question like that.
And final question, let's find, how about this person with the hat in the third row in the red shirt? And let's get a mic. We want to hear you.
Oh, thank you for coming. Mine builds on the past gentleman's question, which is a little bit similar. I understand your arguments about, or your presentation about how many people wanted this man to be president, et cetera. But if you're someone like me who represents people who are not poor and do not have the ability to hire, I don't know, a very, very expensive lawyer, yet they're accused of breaking some same laws. I'm not talking about some of the stuff we're talking about. And yet they see these people of power and privilege that are in the news break laws and don't get punished for them. And then we have these people doing these things that they shouldn't be doing either. But why are we going to jail? Why are we being punished? And I just had a little thought about that. We gotta worry about that too.
Yeah, we do have to worry about that, but I'm not worried about an epidemic of presidents behaving the way Trump behaved, because we've only had 46 presidents anyway, and this is an outlier. And the question is, we want to make sure that we don't do violence to the American body politic and to American law as the final damage done to us by that man. So, I mean, all I'm saying is the fundamental political virtue is prudence. And prudence, as I understand it, is taking crystalline principles but applying them to messy reality. It requires adjustments and compromises and reticence and all kinds of coming to terms with the fact that the world is a mess. But it's a rather nice mess. Thank you very much.